Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Multisolving, featuring Dr. Elizabeth Sawin of the Multisolving Institute. My name is Laura Schnurr. I'm the director of Tamarack's Community Climate Transitions Initiative. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting today on Indigenous land. I myself am calling in from Tiohtià:ke, the traditional unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk people, colonially known as Montreal. And I invite you to reflect on the traditional territory from which you're joining, and feel free to share that in the chat box if you'd like. I also want to recognize the inseparability of what we'll be speaking about today, multi-solving, and Indigenous history, knowledge, and teachings. Since time immemorial, Indigenous peoples have understood social and ecological well-being, as well as economic activity in a holistic way. And it's only through colonial practices, processes, structures that these issues came to be seen as separate. Thus, the work of shifting towards a practice of multi-solving is really one of decolonizing our systems and learning from Indigenous peoples and knowledge. And I'd also like to acknowledge that June is Indigenous History Month, and National Indigenous Peoples Day is approaching on June 21st. We'll share a couple of links in the chat for you to learn more and find activities in your community. So as mentioned a second ago, I do invite you to introduce yourself in the chat box. You can feel free to share your name, organization, and where you're calling in from, including the traditional lands if you'd like. Feel free to take a moment to do that, and I will, in the meantime, introduce our guest speaker today. Dr. Elizabeth Sawin is the founder and director of the Multisolving Institute. She frequently writes and speaks about multi-solving, climate change, and leadership in complex systems. She co-founded Climate Interactive in 2010 and was its co-director from 2010 until last year. Elizabeth's full bio is available on our event page. We'll pop that into the chat, but I'll just say she is an amazing thought leader whose Twitter feed is also a pleasure to follow. It's this beautiful combination of profound wisdom in 280 characters or less, and photos of what's growing in her garden in rural Vermont, where she's based. If you aren't already following her, I encourage you to do so. Her Twitter handle is @BethSawin. So welcome, Beth. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks. I'm really excited to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. So this topic, multi-solving, is of great interest to us here at Tamarack, given that we have campaigns around ending poverty, deepening community, supporting youth, and accelerating climate transitions. We're constantly working to break down the artificial barriers between those issue areas. We're also approaching the program I'm running, Community Climate Transitions, through that multi-solving holistic view. And we're also supporting our learners and members to do the same. We're noticing keen interest from community change makers to take a multi-solving approach, even if that's not the language necessarily being used. And so Beth, you've no doubt also witnessed a growing interest in multi-solving as you recently created and launched the Multisolving Institute. Congratulations on that, by the way. Could you tell us a bit about what is multi-solving, how you define it, and why it is so valuable when it comes to tackling our 21st century challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do that. And you're right, the Multisolving Institute is brand new as of February 1st of this year. And we're a team that's really dedicated to sharing both the idea of multi-solving and best practices. So check out our website. I bet it will show up in your chat because there's a lot of what we'll talk about today is also there. It's just multisolving.org. So the simplest way to think about multi-solving is to think about a single action that gives multiple benefits. Sometimes I just describe something like a community shutting down a coal-fired power plant and replacing that with some sort of clean electricity source. So that addresses climate change on the scale of decades. There will be less greenhouse gases from burning coal for energy. But in the short term, for people who live nearby to that coal-fired power plant, there'll also be a dramatic improvement in air quality. So there's a second benefit, which is better air quality and thus a great reduction in all of the different health problems that come along with air pollution from fossil fuels, including respiratory illnesses, cardiovascular disease, premature birth. Dementia has recently been linked to PM 2.5, the small particles of basically soot created from burning fossil fuels. So one action, shutting down a coal-fired power plant, many benefits. And that happens just by virtue of the way the world works. So my background is in complex systems theory, which is really just a way of engaging with the fact that the world is complex and interconnected and interdependent. And lots of times we're really aware of the problems that stem from that complexity. When we neglect it, problems spiral out of control, or one solution creates a new problem. But there's also a plus side of that interconnection, and multi-solving is about that. It's about learning to work with interconnection instead of against it. And of course, that means learning to work with other people and with other parts of systems, which is where the puzzles, the challenge, the art of multi-solving comes in. I've worked in the environmental field and particularly climate change for many years. You mentioned Climate Interactive, where I was a co-founder and co-director. Climate Interactive focuses on global climate change and computer simulations of climate change. So lots of the examples that I'll mention today have a climate thread somewhere in them. That's partly because of where this work got started. It started at Climate Interactive, but I would say that multi-solving is a way of thinking, acting, and being that may well have a climate component, but doesn't have to. And it touches on equity, justice, food, health, the quality of our neighborhoods. One thing about multi-solving, and I think we'll see this as a theme in our conversation, Laura, is it's not specific to any one scale or any one sector. It's really a way of going about change rather than any particular type of project.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that kind of the evolution as well. It's interesting to see how you went from Climate Interactive, where climate was kind of centered in the organization's name, to the Multisolving Institute, where you kind of decentralized climate, right? And I'm thinking about some of the terminology that's used. We typically talk about co-benefits, right? That example of shutting down the coal plant and some of the co-benefits that you'd see around air quality and pollution and health. That's language that I think people, at least from what I've seen in the climate space, struggle with, don't love. And since I've been using multi-solving the past year or so, a lot of people have been saying, oh, that resonates a lot more with me than co-benefits. And so I'm going to replace that because I never loved co-benefits. So how do you see that? Was there an evolution in the language there? And why use multi-solving as opposed to co-benefits?
Yeah, well, as I just mentioned, I started my work from what I sometimes call the carbon-centric framing. Other people use that word too. I spent many years, as I mentioned, with these computer simulations of climate change, advising governments. Climate Interactive played a role in UN negotiations about pledges that countries are making. And really the currency of all those conversations is carbon dioxide, or maybe if it's broadened a little bit, carbon dioxide plus the other greenhouse gases that contribute to climate change. And I started over time to feel like we obviously weren't making, the progress that is needed on climate. And I'm talking about the perspective of things like the Copenhagen round of UN climate negotiations, or even as recently as the Paris round, where analysts like me would be continually saying we've made some progress and there's further to go. And so where could that further progress be unlocked became a really central question to me. And I started wondering about something that now is not as I don't know, it felt mysterious at the time. So think about sort of 2012, maybe something like that, 2010. What else would get better in the world if we weaned ourselves from fossil fuels? That was a question that I employed a little team of researchers to help me better understand. And at that time, they had to scour the literature in not just climate change, but in labor, what would happen for jobs, in health. We just mentioned this example of how air pollution affects our health. What about economic vitality? What about community well-being, and so on? And you're right that that opened up the door toward what people were studying under the heading of co-benefits. And I worked with that kind of frame for a long time, and I thought that my role as a kind of technical analyst person was to help people see the really sort of interesting findings that were coming out, that sometimes the value of those co-benefits was the same order of magnitude as the costs of addressing climate change. And a lot of people didn't know that in 2010. Many people don't even know that today, although the World Health Organization every year for the last few years, right around the time of the UN climate conferences, they put out a report about climate and health, and they consistently report that the costs of being on track to meet climate goals would be, and these are the words of the World Health Organization, more than offset by the size of the health benefits alone. And that's leaving the potential jobs, equity, other benefits on the side. Many people still view climate change as a big sacrifice to address. And this framing of co-benefits starts to open the door toward thinking of it and wondering about where are those win-win-win opportunities. So I started talking about that, and I started talking with communities about co-benefits. And that's where I ran into what you're naming, Laura, that co-benefits didn't always seem to resonate, and it puzzled me a bit, but I realized that there's an implicit kind of ordering of the importance of the benefits in the word co-benefits. And so you almost don't see that. I almost didn't, coming from that carbon-centric worldview again, which sort of assumes protecting the future against climate change is the main benefit. And then there are these nice to have co-benefits that come along that even could suggest maybe political alliances or the potential for coalitions. But put yourself in the shoes of a community. Let's keep our same example. We've been talking about a place with a coal-fired power plant that's affecting the air quality, that's affecting people's health. And picture you're a parent and you're in the emergency room, maybe for the third time that year with an elementary school child who's having an asthma attack set off by air pollution. What's the co-benefit and what's the main benefit in that situation? And the nice thing about multi-solving is it reminds us that we don't have to choose. In fact, we might make more progress if we didn't. If I, as a climate activist, say the health of your elementary school child in the here and now is as important as the climate future a few decades from now. And if we can find actions to take together that improve both of those at once, let's just get to work at doing that. And we can set aside this question of the most important benefit. And so multi-solving can also, the term, one hope for it is that it can remind us as change agents that there are many perspectives, there are many needs, and the art form, and I think part of the path forward is finding ways to bring those together and to care deeply about all of the impacts, in this case of fossil fuels, not just pick one as kind of our cause and focus.
So beautifully said. Yeah, thanks. And I feel like in this climate emergency that we're finding ourselves in, something's not working with how we're communicating around the need for action, right? I mean, there's been progress in the last years, and we're seeing accelerated action, but still not enough. And I think people who are working in the climate communication space and around like what messaging works are really finding this, that like maybe starting with talking about like the 1.5 degree world and what happens in a 1.7 degree or 2.5 degree world. And these are the GHG emissions reductions that we need to stay with. Maybe that's not language that's going to resonate with everyone, right? And with all audiences. And so maybe starting about like the improved health benefits and the kids with asthma and what this could mean is really like a better starting point, and thus really appreciate that question of what is the co-benefit here, and maybe it's climate, like GHG emissions reductions is the co-benefit, right? Depending on where you sit. So really appreciate that. You've given a couple of examples already, but was curious if you could dive into some successful examples of multi-solving, and from your experience, what helps enabling to enable multi-solving efforts to be successful.
Yeah, I'm definitely happy to do that. In fact, that's often how I explain multi-solving, is by sharing stories and examples, because I think it quickly moves from the abstract to the familiar, to the imaginable, to something really tangible. So, and one of the things that we do at the Multisolving Institute is we find it helpful to write what we call case studies. So you'll find some of these on our website that show what people have accomplished with a multi-solving approach. It's from looking across those case studies that I'll actually try to answer the second half of your question, which is like, is there a way of going about it? But the first part, just a few examples. I'll start with one that's at sort of a neighborhood scale. It's called the Baltimore Orchard Project. And it was a project that responded to a few needs at the same time, which of course is a hallmark of multi-solving. So one was a need in a neighborhood for better access to fresh fruits and vegetables. So it was a neighborhood where it wasn't easy to come by those things. And so an orchard is, obviously a way to directly supply food in a place that maybe it's hard to get fresh fruits and vegetables. So it was fruit trees and nut trees. The second thing that this project addresses is something I bet a lot of people listening are familiar with, which is the urban heat island effect, which is especially pronounced in places that don't have very much vegetation, and urban areas that have a lot of buildings and pavement and concrete, which often corresponds also with historically marginalized or disinvested neighborhoods. So increasing the number of trees is also addresses the urban heat island effect. And we know that with the climate change, we can't prevent high heat events are going to become more extreme and more frequent. So it's also an investment in climate change adaptation. And this project was spearheaded by groups that included an interest in youth job development. There's a lot of skills to be learned in planting and then taking care of an urban orchard. So there's horticulture and landscaping and skills like that. And so this was a project that was able to bring those interests, so employment, climate resilience, and food security and health together in one project. And that's at the neighborhood scale. Another project that I am fond of is one that we learned about in New Zealand called Warm-Up New Zealand. And this started as a response to the 2008-2009 financial crisis, which was depressing the construction industry in New Zealand. And so it was an energy efficiency home energy upgrade project that aimed to reduce the energy dependence of residential homes while also putting people in the construction industry back to work. And it ended up doing that. But then the really interesting thing to me about this project was they looked at the health of the people living within those buildings, and they found fewer visits to the emergency department and reduced expenses for medications, because simply living in a tighter, warmer, more cozy, better ventilated home was improving the health of the people living within them. And that observation expanded the program to the point where when we were studying it a few years ago, physicians were able to refer patients into this program for home energy improvement. So sometimes I would joke, instead of take an aspirin and call me in the morning, it's like get better windows and get a new boiler. And so obviously there you're spanning problems from climate change to the energy burden, which is the term that's sometimes used for the way that just the cost of energy and utilities hits people with the lowest income the hardest. So it was reducing the costs of people in these homes and then improving their health, and then being a source of economic activity. So that's a national example. If we had more time, we could talk about businesses like a hospital that had a program to turn off equipment when it wasn't in use and actually improved patient outcomes in the process. We could talk about regional programs that span more than one country. One thing that we see about multi-solving is that we basically find it at every scale that we look. And that might be an interesting thing we could talk about maybe in the Q&A, like why that is, I think is an interesting question.
Yeah, definitely. I'd love to dive more into that. Thanks for sharing those inspiring examples. That note about sort of different prescription that the doctor might give reminded me of the woman in BC, I think this was late last year, who was believed to be the world's first person to receive an official diagnosis that climate change was the cause of her ailments. So that was really interesting to see.
I hadn't heard about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So are there specific tools and approaches that you find helpful for translating this concept of multi-solving into action?
Yeah. There's a lot of ways to answer that. One of them is that's essentially the purpose of the Multisolving Institute. So stay tuned, sign up for our newsletter, which is the best way to hear about our webinars and new tools as we release them. Another way to answer that question, and this is an article that people could Google and find the link for it. After we did these case studies that included that New Zealand one and the hospital that I was just mentioning, I wrote an article for the Stanford Social Innovation Review called The Magic of Multisolving. And in that article, I was grappling with what we were starting to learn was that multisolving seemed to be showing up everywhere, right? So I mentioned all these scales, but it wasn't limited to particular sectors either. It could be in food, it could be in transportation, it could be in housing. And so we looked across all this diversity. It seemed, very site specific. Even if you just looked at the transportation ones, they were all different from each other because they were meeting the particular needs on the ground. And so trying to sort of make sense of that complexity, that's what led to this article, where we started to identify what we thought was the same across all these projects. And so this is hopefully another kind of way to get at your question, Laura, because some of the things we noticed led us to start saying that multi-solving isn't so much a what as it is a way. It's more of a way of approaching things than a particular type of project. So what did we notice? We noticed multi-solving projects usually started small and seem to grow organically. They aren't so often, at least the successful ones that we studied in our scans, they're not like a big top-down effort. They often might start with just one or two sectors and then begin to notice what it was that was changing. And like in that New Zealand example, when they realized they were having health impacts, that drew more partners in. So that type of just start somewhere, cross one of these boundaries between two different problems, and pay a lot of attention to what's changing, because that may be the fuel that then brings more partners forward. So small, organic, and kind of learning oriented, those are a few of the themes. Another one is sort of an insistence that everyone matters and everyone is needed. And this relates again to us saying there really isn't a hierarchy of problems. Climate change with a multi-solving lens isn't more important than equity or more important than health. They all matter. That means everyone involved matters, which quickly leads these projects to grappling with I'd say crises across all of our societies of inequities of different sorts, racial inequity, economic inequity, gender inequity, and so on, that true multi-solving projects invest energy in undoing historic inequities, in learning about them, grappling with them. And in fact, addressing inequity in itself is a multi-solving solution. Many of you probably know many of the ways in which simply improving equity ripples out into lots of other benefits, right? Uh, if you improve the equity of access to education, that ripples out through a lifetime of people's what they are able to accomplish and how they contribute to their communities. The book The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee, it's pretty much an entire book focused on the ways that a more equitable society is a multi-solving intervention. And equity shows up in multi-solving projects in the other way as well. It's an intervention, but it's also a way of working. If you really are going to weave these problems together, then how the people within a multi-solving project relate to each other and whether they embody equity as a value is really key to the success of the project.
Thanks for that. I'm curious if you could speak a little more about what the size of the opportunity is here, if we figure out how to successfully shift to a multi-solving mindset.
Yeah, I think the size of the opportunity is actually mind-bogglingly large. I mentioned that World Health Organization study, and I'll just say it again because it's so important. And I find that many people don't know about it. It's interesting that report comes out at about the same time each year as the emissions gap report, which says, you know, there's a lot further to go on getting our emissions down. And somehow lost in the publicity is what I think of as really good news from the World Health Organization. That being on track to meet the Paris Agreement climate goals would be more than offset by the health system savings of doing that. I mean, that to me says that if we don't manage to really take the level of action that's needed on climate change, it's not so much that we won't have the technology or that we couldn't afford it. It would be that we haven't solved this social problem of how to put two problems together and find the synergies between them. So that's one example that I think says how large this opportunity is. Another one, unfortunately, is another example of a missed opportunity. Has to do with a massive spending around the world in response to COVID-19. So, you know, governments had an interest in stimulating economies because of the pandemic slowdown. We now know that something like $17 trillion were invested in those programs around the world. At the beginning of the pandemic, a group of energy and climate scientists looked at how much would it cost per year to get on track toward these Paris Agreement goals that we've been talking about. And they knew a stimulus was likely coming, and they were trying to make the point that a small fraction of that stimulus could make a huge difference to being on track to climate goals. Because of course, this is multi-solving, right? You can stimulate an economy by investing in clean energy. You're accomplishing two problems at the same time. And they estimated something like $1.4 trillion a year in the near term to move from the path we're on, which is some progress, but not fast enough, to that faster track. So 17 trillion got spent in the end. 1.4 trillion of it focused on that synergy between economic recovery and clean energy investment would have been enough. And the reality, according to the International Energy Agency, is something like 0.4, 0.5 trillion. So even that kind of low bar out of 17 trillion, the world wasn't organized in a way to fully step forward. And even more unfortunately, almost as much got spent on fossil energy out of stimulus dollars. I think that was about 0.3, so around 380 billion out of the 17 trillion. So I think those are at the global scale where we have the numbers that paint some sense of the opportunity. And of course, that trickles all the way down to the very local scale. I was talking recently with someone who focuses on land conservation. and his organization was grappling with the impact of inflation right now, where you know, $1 million to buy and protect and conserve land won't buy as many acres today as it might have a few years ago, just because of inflation. And he was saying how important it was that conservation projects be designed in ways to accomplish multiple things at once, right? Can they also provide jobs, or can they in some way help fight climate change or sequester carbon, as well as protect biodiversity? So that's, I think, going to be more and more of a theme, because we face many problems, resources are constrained. It's sometimes just really the simple practicality of, can you make $1 accomplish multiple things?
Totally. Yeah, and thanks for really highlighting the return on investment, the huge return on investment to multi-solving. Clearly, there's the numbers to back this up. The evidence is there that there would be huge benefits to doing this. So I'm curious, given this huge opportunity, what's stopping us? Like, what are the barriers to multi-solving, and maybe particularly focusing on the local level? And how can we address those barriers?
Yeah, well, I feel pretty sure that people on the call know a number of these and have run into them, and feel free to type some of those into the chat. But I can name the ones that we observe and the ones that we hear about from people who are multi-solving. I'll start with how we're educated. So most of us are trained in disciplines, and each discipline has, you know, its own particular language, publishes its results in a certain set of journals, shows up to share knowledge at a certain set of conferences. So each of those is an obstacle to multi-solving. So it starts with where we're trained, and then we tend to replicate a lot of those silos of disciplines in how organizations and institutions are constructed. If you think about state or local government, there's a health department, a transportation department, and an energy department. They might be in different buildings. They might have different mandates, and almost always they make their budgetary decisions separately. Yet we keep talking about examples where multiple problems could be solved if investment was oriented around you know, several goals at the same time. So that, all of that about how we set up our institutions is definitely a challenge to multi-solving. There's also the challenge of jurisdictions. A good example of that is many cities are now facing flooding from more extreme rainfall, more extreme precipitation with climate change. That looks like, you know, downpours that flood a certain low-lying neighborhoods and cities. And sometimes the easiest and cheapest solution to that is actually to repair and restore wetlands, possibly far upstream at the top of watersheds. So you might have a city that has political will and a budget to address this kind of flooding challenge, but they don't own or make decisions about upstream land. And that might be, you know, a county or a different municipality. And so without structures to help create the partnerships to get that done, those opportunities can sit on the table. So we've got disciplines, silos in how we set up our organizations, budgets, jurisdictions. And one more that I would add is a bit more, I guess, about human beings and leadership, but it's attachment to our identities as experts. So one thing about multi-solving is, by definition almost, if you're bringing a number of problems together to see if you can make more progress when they're bundled, there's going to be no one who's an expert on finding that solution, right? And if your identity, if your job security comes more from talking than from listening, from being the, you know, renowned expert on transportation, but you don't know much about public health and you're not used to being a learner, you're not going to be a great multi-solving partner. So we all need to be really strong in our expertise, but we need to hold that lightly for multi-solving, with really deep wells of curiosity and kind of beginner mind about the things that we don't know.
I love that. And thanks for bringing that aspect into this, because I think it's really easy to jump to some of the things that are outside of our control, right? It's like, oh, but the institutions we're working within are so siloed, and our budgets and jurisdictional issues and all of that. It kind of can make us feel like powerless in this. And I think that piece around what we need to do, what we need to change within ourselves is also so key, and one that we don't speak about as much. So I'm curious if you have advice in that regard for change makers, perhaps people who are primarily whose work is primarily issue specifics. Maybe they're working specifically on climate or on poverty, or they have that deep expertise and knowledge in a certain area, how to make that transition to multi-solving.
Yeah, well, sometimes I joke that the first multi-solving intervention is a cup of coffee. But kind of what I mean by that is, again, that sense of curiosity of reaching out to people in the other department, or if you work in city government, being really curious and developing relationships with people who work in community-based organizations and vice versa. So another theme about multi-solving, because it does take time, one of the main modalities for it seems to be growing trusting relationships between different parts of a system. Sometimes we talk about it as rewiring systems, and that doesn't happen overnight. Often this rewiring work is actually best done in advance of real moments of opportunity or real moments of need. At least that's one of our observations. Like, imagine a big grant gets announced, or there's a sudden change in the mayor's administration and they're more open to community-oriented transit. You know that there's opportunities for youth jobs and improved air quality and more biodiversity and more health from people getting the daily physical activity they need, like all these possible benefits. But if you just start thinking about that on the day the RFP gets announced, or the day the mayor says we're open for proposals, there's really not time to build, in our experience, the kinds of coalitions and relationships that are needed to move into that opportunity. So I would encourage people to think about your multi-solving sometimes as trying to build those connections with faith that moments are going to come. You may not be able to predict exactly when and where they are. And know that if you've built these rewired systems, they are really flexible and capable of moving into opportunities. And also in this time where we're all experiencing shocks and impacts and challenges, whether that's climate change or the pandemic, the same holds true. If you have built connections across parts of systems, there's creativity for rapid response, for moving in to take care of people, to protect people, to play defense politically if that's what's needed. And if, to the extent that I'm not sure how many people listening in here are think of themselves as funders, but there's a particular opportunity for funders, I think, to foster this type of activity. So, it's all great for me to say you should take time out of your day and have a cup of coffee with someone who works in a different department or a different part of the city. But we all know that budgets are tight, people's time is really precious. And so there's a very high leverage opportunity for creating the conditions without a super amount of goal directedness. Like, the outcome is rewiring the system, and the trust is that will allow for multi-solving to happen. And I hope to be able in the next couple of years to make the case for that even better. We're starting a really exciting research project funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to look at and try to document these types of investments in rewiring systems and really add up what they accomplish. I think right now it's hard for funders to have confidence that that's a really good bet in uncertain times. Anecdotally, I'm really convinced of that. And so we're hoping to document that more. So also I'm putting out a call me if you feel like you have a great example of that, because we're trying to sort of gather and organize that body of evidence some more.
Neat, thank you. Some questions are starting to come in. Thank you. A quick reminder to participants to please put your questions in, ideally in the Q&A box. I see some coming into the chat as well. We will be getting to those very shortly. I want to maybe ask you one more question before we get to the audience Q&A, and just diving a little bit deeper into that point you made around navigating through tumultuous times and shocks, because we're living through the pandemic, continue to, and the foreseeable future. I think we need to be better prepared for this, and like you said, it's much better to have those coffee dates and make those connections before something happens in terms of an opportunity, but I think also in terms of when our next crisis should hit, right? So how do we keep multi-solving through these shocks, and what can we do better?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would say is multi-solving itself, I believe, is a response to these rising shocks. So I mentioned one of the strains in my own thinking that led to my interest in multi-solving, which was, very high level at the UN, seeing the limits of the carbon-centric framing. But I had another experience at that same time, much closer to home, which is you mentioned I live in Vermont, and my home state of Vermont and a lot of the Northeast was impacted by Tropical Storm Irene. And the damage around me was really massive. Many people experienced flooding, roads and bridges were destroyed. My kids' schools were closed down for weeks because teachers and students couldn't access them. Luckily my family was okay, and mostly we were just trying to help our neighbors. But I had the kind of early sense, and now this is probably more common for all of us, like here I am working on and studying climate change, and I just experienced an event likely made worse by climate change. I should learn from this. And so I hired a young student who had just graduated from college with a social science degree, and I gave her a camera and a tape recorder, and I asked her to just document what was happening around the state. And the main thing that we realized was the way in which by far the first response to this disaster was from small businesses, churches, and social service agencies. People who work on disasters know this, but FEMA, so in the US, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, was days behind these other organizations. And it was the food pantry who actually had a list of volunteers and an email service that worked. And the church who knew who needed diapers and who needed fresh water. It was a local worker-owned cooperative brewery that had a water filtration system, and they just opened it up to the public for anybody who didn't have safe water at the time. And so what I started to realize, just because it was happening in front of me, was that there are these investments that in non-emergency times are really paying off for our communities, the food pantries, the churches, the local owned and worker owned businesses that are also this amazing source of resilience in shocks. And that more investment in that sort of backbone and infrastructure of communities was both a climate change adaptation strategy and just good the rest of the time. And so that was that experience of Tropical Storm Irene, for me, kind of set my curiosity about what else is it that we can do that accomplishes multiple things at the same time. So that's one layer, I would say, of multi-solving. I've seen it elsewhere. We have really close partners, an organization in Atlanta, Georgia, called Partnership for Southern Equity, from whom I've learned a lot about multi-solving, community-based organizing, and racial and economic equity. And a project we had there was just on the cusp of releasing a small grants program that was based on green infrastructure and parks and sort of community amenities. And we had criteria around those things, and we released the funds, and then the pandemic started. And a really amazing thing happened that I observed, which was almost none of those projects ended up doing what they said they were going to do. They weren't necessarily planting flowers or setting up swing sets, but they were doing things like meeting with senior citizens on their front porches and helping them get their phones set up so that they could get COVID updates, or so that they could access their doctor's office for telemedicine. And so the ability of organizations rooted in communities to pivot is another thing that tells me that when you're doing this rewiring of systems, even if your goal may be some big climate goal or some big jobs goal, you're accomplishing something else. You're leaving a trace behind of these relationships that allow systems to respond in moments of stress and shocks. So that's the first thing I would say, is that by multi-solving, by deciding to multi-solve at all, you already are responding to tumultuous times, no matter kind of what the goal of your multi-solving project is. Then I think there's a second level where we all have a lot more to learn, is how to design these multi-solving projects so that they are not swamped or eroded or destroyed by impacts and shocks. And there's probably a whole hour-long conversation, about that, Laura, of what that could be. But some of the things I would have people think about is building in redundancy, making sure that in your projects there's always, multiple people who know how to do everything. In our organization, we're sometimes thinking about how to not run at 110 capacity, where everyone is flat out all the time, because then when someone is sick or someone is helping their community or helping their family who's sick, things fall apart. Like, I think we need to start running with some reserves in everything that we do. And those reserves might also be physical. They might be supplies. They might be financial in terms of rainy day funds. So I don't have all the answers at all about that, but I would encourage people to just in their project design and in talking with their funders to start opening those doors.
Yeah, that's a great response. No, thank you. There's a few questions coming in. I've been monitoring, and maybe first quick one in the in response to the prior question, you had mentioned a research project, and there was a question if you could share more information about that, Beth.
Not a lot more. It's very new. We were happy to get the news not long ago, and it's a 2-year project that we're just getting started. But the research question, I would maybe just restate that. We think about it in terms of the multi-solving return on investment. The investment is, as many of you know, because I know you do this kind of work, it takes time, money, and attention to cultivate relationships that allow people to multi-solve, right? It often doesn't look like much. Sometimes I joke, it just looks like a bunch of people in a basement with a flip chart and coffee or something. Like, well, what are you actually doing, right? Many of you probably get that question. Sometimes when we're helping facilitate multi-solving work, even the people in the room experiencing the growth of these relationships that are going to allow them to multi-solve kind of scratch their heads like, wait, what are we actually doing? Because you can't point to the plaque or the tree that just got planted, or, it looks like conversation, learning, listening. We think that the support to do that is one of the most, if not the most important conditions for multi-solving. Yet it can be pretty hard to justify to funders or to justify to your boss, like, yeah, I want to spend 2 hours a week or 4 hours a month at this just talking to people meeting. And we think that there's, because it's hard to study, there isn't really a great literature that shows what you can count on to happen as a result of that kind of investment. I think a lot of us who do this work have our experiences, we have our anecdotes, but we're looking for, can we design a more systematic way to show these benefits? And part of what makes it complicated, as you can imagine, first of all, it's multi-solving, so the benefits are happening across many areas. So how do you in one equation, put fewer kids with asthma right now and reduce climate change for the future? Or how do you measure, what is the value of more conversations about racial equity and a policy that shifted in procurement and so on? So first of all, it's like the apples and oranges problem. Then there's the time scale problem, because not all these benefits happen at the same time. And how long do you have to watch to really trace, 5 years ago, these two organizations started partnering and they just had a breakthrough now. Like, how do we credit that? And then because all this is happening in complex systems, it's very rare that there's one actor who accomplishes one thing, right? Where there's the getting credit or giving credit. This way of collaboratively working has multiple factors coming together. And so again, if you want to do some kind of accounting, how do you do that in a way that's rigorous and acknowledges the complexity? But one thing we say in systems thinking is, just because something's hard to measure doesn't mean its value is zero. But a lot of times I think that's what happens, because we can't really diagnose the multi-solving return on investment. It gets undercounted. And then where that shows up as a problem is, I believe there are so many sympathetic, say, program officers at foundations or people structuring public investment in cities and states who have this intuitive leaning to fund this type of work, but then they run into some roadblock that's like, well, that sounds kind of soft, that sounds mushy, like, what are we going to get for that? So this research project, I hope, will help people have a better answer when they get that question of what are we going to get for that? And maybe we'll have a follow-up in 2 years, Laura, and I can tell you what we found out.
Right, that'd be amazing. Yeah, there's some comments in the chat, like, we need a part B to this webinar, and appreciation for that last comment. Just because something is hard to measure doesn't mean its value is zero. Cool. So we just have time for like maybe one or two more. There's a great question that just came up around related to what you were just speaking about, and that how do we hold the tension between the time required to do multi-solving well and the sense of urgency and accountability to produce results in the short term?
Yeah, boy, I feel that one every day. I have two quotes that hang near my desk, and one of them, I'll just paraphrase it, but it's from Wendell Berry, who says something. He's talking to a group of young people, and he says something along the lines of, what you're facing is an emergency, and it's the kind of emergency that can only be addressed with patience. And it takes a lot of character to be patient in an emergency. So that's one thing that I think about a lot. A friend and colleague, I mentioned Partnership for Southern Equity. They're led by Nathaniel Smith. And he says, this work moves at the speed of trust. And so that's where the patience comes in. Sometimes, though, I urge people to think about, well, what's the alternative? It is slow, but is there any other way to accomplish what we need to accomplish that doesn't start with healing the fractures and the artificial divisions that we've created in systems? So that's one quote. The second one is from Grace Lee Boggs. And she says, it's not a matter of critical mass, it's a matter of critical connections. And of course, multi-solving is about weaving those critical connections. And one thing that complex systems theory teaches is this principle of emergence, that the way you change the behavior of a system is by changing the connections within it. And sometimes a very small change in connection can unlock a lot of change in system behavior. So I don't think we need to assume that this work is going to always be slow. I think we're never going to know which critical connection is the one that unlocks a state change, a phase change, a systems transformation. But I know system transformation doesn't happen without changing connections. So that's, where I'm investing my time and energy while being keenly aware of urgency and emergency.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a really great place to close. And you did touch on a couple of the remaining questions, sort of the relationship between multi-solving and a systems thinking approach, and also one on making the case for multi-solving capacity within HR, organizational and professional development, and change management. So yeah, thanks for sort of weaving some of those ideas in. So just really grateful that you were here with us today, Beth, sharing tremendous wisdom and insights from your work over the past decades. There's so much for us to continue learning. I encourage everyone on the call to sign up for your newsletter, follow you on Twitter, and just continue, let's continue this conversation. One upcoming opportunity that I wanted to share on our end is a webinar in a couple of weeks that does really build off this topic, specifically focus on municipalities and how municipalities can respond to complexity and solve for sustainability, climate equity by transforming their strategic management practices. So that's with Randy side of Refocus, and we'll put a link to that in the chat so you can learn more. Otherwise, just thank you for being here today. Feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions. There's my email address. I'd love to hear from you, and look forward to seeing you next time. We will be sending the recording out along with links and resources in a follow-up email shortly, so stay tuned for that. Thanks very much again, Beth, and everyone for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I had a good time. Bye, everybody.